Let's flip it over to the NFC today, and let's start off with the Philadelphia Eagles. Their win total is set at 10.5. They're minus 125 to win the NFC East, plus 1,400 to win the Super Bowl, all courtesy of Bally Bet. The Eagles started last season 10-1 before losing five of their last six down the stretch and getting embarrassed by the Buccaneers in the playoffs. Which version of Philly are we going to see this season?
Yeah, that's a good question because that team that started 10-1, they were 10-1. They won a lot of games, but there was a lot of luck involved. There was three specific games I remember clearly: home against the Cowboys, at the Chiefs, and home against the Bills, where they either were outgained by a lot or won the turnover battle or were losing at some point and had some sort of comeback because Jalen Hurts made a throw after being pretty effective early in the game. So we kind of knew regression was coming, and I thought maybe they could be a regression candidate this year, but the regression hit them hard last year. They lost 5 of 6. They got embarrassed in the playoffs by the Buccaneers. So instead of trying to just run it back and say like, oh, we were a good team, we made the playoffs still. They did go out and make two big coordinator hires, and Kellen Moore for the offensive coordinator and Vic Fangio for the defensive coordinator. And I just think this offense with Kellen Moore calling the plays, with Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, you have a good offensive line. Even though you lose Jason Kelsey to retirement, it's still a good offensive line, and they always have had good depth. So I'm sure they'll have a good center. That won't be too much of a drop off from Jason Kelsey, who was kind of getting older anyway. And then you bring in Saquon Barkley, and I know I'm not really a huge fan of running back signings, but Barkley's a little bit different because he can contribute in the passing game. And Saquon Barkley behind a really good offensive line and not the one he had to run behind for the Giants last year should be a really productive, effective player for this offense. So I do like this Philly offense with Kellen Moore, and then defensively, Vic Fangio is definitely a coordinator who I like out of pretty much any coordinator in the NFL, especially on that side of the ball. They did go out, fix their secondary through free agency. They drafted two cornerbacks for their first two picks in the draft. So a lot big emphasis on fixing their pass defense, which is definitely a plus. In terms of the betting market, their Eagles have been bought a lot this season. I think part of the reason why is because of the two coordinators, but also there's an aggressive sell on the Dallas Cowboys. And it kind of makes sense if you're just kind of following the NFL news, even if you're not engaged in the betting market. So I still want to see what Philly looks like because they're probably priced correctly at 10.5 juiced over on the win total and odds on to win the division. I'm really looking forward to that week
Sure.
one game in Sao Paulo, Brazil when they play the Packers because we'll kind of see what the changes look like in Philly. And I kind of want to see it first before believing in it.
Yeah, that'll be a fun one. Let's strip it down to Jerry World and talk about the Dallas Cowboys. Their win total is set at 9.5, plus 170 to win the NFC East, and plus 2,000 to win the Super Bowl, all courtesy of Bally Bet. Cowboys have won 12 games in their last three seasons, but have only gotten one playoff win out of those three seasons. Are the Cowboys going to put together another strong regular season, or are they in trouble meeting expectations this year?
Yeah, I think they're in trouble. I know they have had those 12-win seasons and the regular season looks good, but a lot of those wins are just when they're playing from ahead, they get a couple turnovers, they get some early
Mm-hmm.
scores, and when the defense can kind of feast with a pass rush led by Micah Parsons. And that's just not a sustainable way to win, especially when you have to end up playing better teams. I'm also just kind of worried about their running game because they have Ezekiel Elliott as their main back. They just signed Dalvin Cook this week, and just two guys probably over the hill. And because of that, the Cowboys are going to make it obvious that they're going to pass the ball, and teams are going to try to defend CeeDee Lamb and just kind of defend the pass. So it's a really one dimensional offense. Their offensive line is a lot weaker than it has been in the past. And then the big change defensively on that side of the ball, Dan Quinn leaves in the division to be the Commanders head coach, and you bring in Mike Zimmer, who's been out of the NFL for a while. I know he was a pretty good head coach, especially against the spread early in his career with the Vikings, and has coordinated some good defense, but has to be some concerns that the game has kind of passed him by because he's a little bit older. And this is a defense that has forced a lot of turnovers over the last few years and have been playing in good game scripts where if they have a lead, they know that the other team's going to pass, and that's how they force strip sacks, interceptions, and that's just I don't think sustainable to force that many turnovers over time. There's a reason why professional bettors have hammered the Cowboys from a win total that opened at 10.5 and now is down to 9.5. And I'm not really interested in terms of betting the 9.5 under still because it has moved a full game. But I am betting against them in week one when they go to play the Cleveland Browns. I am a little bit higher on the Browns, and just with the market's kind of bearishness of the Cowboys, it makes sense to fade the Cowboys week one in that late afternoon game in Cleveland.
Fading the man who says he's quote unquote the best GM in the league. All right, let's move over to the Washington Commanders. Their win total is set at 6.5 plus 900 to win the NFC East, 125 to 1 odds to win the Super Bowl, all courtesy of Bally Bet. Commanders totally overhauled their team this offseason, highlighted by new head coach, as you mentioned earlier, Dan Quinn, and drafting QB Jaden Daniels. Are you optimistic about the Commanders' new look this year?
So I will say I'm optimistic right away. I bet them week one +4 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's a little bit of a fade on the Bucks,
Okay.
but also just kind of liking what's going on in Washington. Maybe not from making a playoff perspective, at least this year, or something big. But I do like Dan
Yeah.
Quinn. He's a massive upgrade over Ron Rivera, just in terms of a leader, I believe, and also just a defensive schemer. Which, I mean, the Commanders' defense was trending in the wrong direction with a guy who's supposed to be a defensive mind in Rivera. So Dan Quinn, at least, he's going to be a better defensive coach. Maybe they could have got a better head coach. I know they kind of missed out on Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator from Lions. I think he was the organization's first choice. And then Mike McDonald, who they would have definitely loved to take from the Ravens, but McDonald chose the Seahawks. But maybe Dan Quinn can learn from some of the mistakes he made. Not the best game manager when he was the head coach of the Falcons, but I think a lot of coaches they are a head coach for the first time, they learn from their mistakes, become a really good coordinator, and then they have a second chance and take advantage of it. So that's, I think, kind of the hope for the Washington franchise, who has a new ownership group. So it's a little bit of a different vibe there, where they're actually a more likable team and not owned by Daniel Snyder. So I think the defense is going to
Yeah.
be fun, or at least better, even though the talent might not be there yet. And they did lose or traded Montez Sweat and Chase Young last offseason.
Hmm.
So the defense is still kind of, it's rebuilding, I'd say, but at least they have the right guy in charge. But the offense is definitely what's interesting to me. Jaden Daniels, Heisman Trophy winner last year. He was a pretty
Yeah.
exciting player. He did have 2 first-round picks playing at wide receiver with him, and a really good offensive line. But there's definitely potential there, not just with his arm, but with his legs. And in an offense that's coordinated by Cliff Kingsbury, who's probably another coach that, as a head coach, was making questionable in-game decisions. But if you just let
Yeah.
him focus on drawing up plays and scheming, I think he could be a pretty fun offense in Washington. So yeah, I like them in week one. I think the win total is right at 6.5. It has a win total that hasn't moved much this offseason. So the original number was set pretty right. But yeah, I'm on Washington in week one. So hope they get that win there, and or at least get the cover, and then we'll see how to, or I'll at least reassess what I want to do with Washington after hopefully a good performance in the opener.
Yeah. Going to be interesting to see what the young QB can lead them to this season. Let's go over to the Big Apple and talk about the New York Giants. Their win total is set at 6.5. They're plus 1,400 to win the NFC East, plus 150 to 1 odds to win the Super Bowl, all courtesy of Bally Bet. The Giants overachieved in 2022 by making the playoffs, and they actually won a playoff game. Last year, though, they started 2-8. Daniel Jones got hurt. They came back down to earth. What's your read on the Giants going into this season?
Yeah, so last year they were a complete sell for me. I thought the 2022 team was just overachieving, winning all these close games, and
Yep.
just Brian Dable finding ways for Daniel Jones to win games. And probably unfortunate for the franchise that that season occurred and they made the playoffs and made the divisional round before getting dusted by the Eagles, because it forced them to pay Daniel Jones, and now they're kind of
Yeah.
stuck. So yeah, it's going to be interesting what happens this year. Last year was a very bad year, where it was ended up being, it kind of was a respectable season at the end because Tommy DeVito was winning games out of nowhere, but they were 5-12, and it was just kind of a miserable season from the get go for the Giants. The reason I'm going to stay away from kind of betting the under, even though that's the way I would look, because I'm still down on the Giants, is I do respect Brian Dable as a head coach. He definitely, to help develop Josh Allen in Buffalo. He kind of just knows what he's doing, I think, and in terms of just a offensive game planner. I did bet against the Giants though in week one. They're playing the Vikings. I'm a little bit higher on the market than, or I'm higher on the Vikings than the market is. So that's what led me to that bet at a pretty much a pick 'em price in New York. So yeah, I'm fading the Giants early in week one. Still have questions about Daniel Jones. Still have a lot of questions about an offensive line that was horrible last year. I know they were unhealthy or had a lot of injuries, and they could be healthy this year, but it doesn't mean they're going to be a a good cohesive unit. And then I also have questions about their back seven on defense in the secondary at linebackers. They do have some nice pieces in the pass rush. They get Brian Burns, Dexter Lawrence is there in the middle, but still, and Kayvon Thibodeau too. So yeah, it's a pretty good pass rush. It's just behind that, if they're not going to get home, I feel like teams can have a lot of success on this Giants defense. So maybe some positives for the Giants where they'll be better than last year, but I don't think it's going to translate into much better of a record for New York.
All right, Nate. Hard question here. Which team is going to win the NFC East?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go with the Eagles. Maybe it's because the betting market has kind of indicated that Philly is a buy team, the Cowboys are a sell team. The two other teams aren't necessarily division contenders,
Yeah.
but I'll go with Philly and kind of bank on over a long season that offense being better with Kellen Moore calling the plays and just kind of running a faster pace, which should benefit Jalen Hurts. AJ Brown, I think, is in for a really big season for Philly. And then defensively, Vic Fangio. Maybe it'll take a little bit for the players to get that scheme, but I think over a long season, the Eagles will come out on top, especially against a Cowboys team that I just don't have a lot of hopes in, and their offensive line is a mess. And the defense, I think, takes a pretty significant step back if they're not turning the ball over.